Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. So where are you guys?
We are in Denmark right now.
Denmark, wow. That's far away. I'm in Canada, but I'm originally American.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about this project.
Sorry, what?
Yes.
Yeah, tell me about your project and what you want to know.
Sorry, yeah, we're doing a project about Me Too, the hashtag, and also just about like sexual harassment in general and stuff like that. And we saw an article or something, it was about you, and we've read it and we thought it was very interesting, and also the project requires us to interview someone, so we thought it was a perfect opportunity if we could get to interview you. So we just got a couple of questions, nothing too crazy.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Mm-hmm. And are you guys are in high school or college?
We go to high school, yeah.
High school, yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. So, what made John Lasseter so sexist and disrespectful to women? Why do you think?
Why do I think? Well, I mean, to assume to know what makes someone else tick is a little bit presumptuous, but from a broader perspective, not just speaking specifically about John, I would say in general, men in positions of power are often given like a lot of freedom and a lot of liberty to behave in kind of any way that they really want to, especially if they're very successful and they earn, build a really powerful company, or they earn a lot of money, or they win a lot of awards. And so I think that it's kind of something that comes along with success. And in the male role, whenever men are successful, oftentimes they utilize that position of power to just behave in whatever way sort of stimulates them or is interesting to them. And so I think that over the years, men like John who are in a position of power, they don't get told no very often. And that would happen, around work things as well, not just around personal things or sexual things. Like his ideas, oftentimes people would maybe disagree with some choice that he had for a character or a story point in the story, but everyone was so afraid to say no because he was one of the founding fathers of the company and also basically the founding father of 3D animation. So with that power and that privilege and with that status and that notoriety, it often creates this dynamic of silence where people who perceive themselves as being sort of lower in the hierarchy are really afraid to speak out. And then I think that there's an institutional problem where companies and institutions, they end up valuing these particular figureheads, these power players, more than they value morality, for instance, or checking people on their behavior or having like a really healthy company culture. And so I think that happens a lot in corporations where the money, it's like profits over people kind of mentality happens. And it's really subconscious, and it's sort of ingrained in our psychology as Westerners and as people who live in a capitalistic system, to sometimes value money over all else. Money and success, I would say. If that makes sense. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Mm-hmm. So next question. How exactly do you feel about John Lasseter getting fired at Pixar?
I have mixed feelings about it. I'm going to try to feel into why. In some ways, it was kind of like he became a father figure to me. And I think he had that sort of persona to a lot of people in the company. And so in some ways it feels like witnessing like your father being fired for something, but knowing that, that he played a large part in that as well. And so, I don't want to discredit the talent that John Lasseter has and sort of the visionary capabilities as a director and as a filmmaker that he has. Like, I think those things are separate from his personal behavior, because it's very complicated, my feelings on the matter. Like, for instance, there was another production designer at Pixar who, when I wrote the article, I named John Lasseter, but I also spoke about lots of other incidences and stories of different men in leadership roles who impacted women in negative ways. And there was this one other production designer in particular who was fired as a result of my article. John wasn't actually fired as a result of my article. John was suspended and kind of outed for his bad behavior before I published. And then I think maybe my article had something to do with him not being brought on after a year sabbatical. But this other production designer, he was actually fired as a direct result of what I wrote. And I felt some guilt about that because that's a lot of responsibility because this is somebody's career. But I also felt it's a mixed bag. Like, I feel like we should know better as a culture and as a society not to treat women like they're objects and pieces of meat. However, I think that particular production designer that was fired, he was institutionally propped up and supported in that behavior for many years. And the company didn't actually pull him aside and say, hey, we've had women complain, you're not behaving right. Here's an opportunity for you to change your behavior. He wasn't really given that opportunity because the company was constantly ignoring, or at least it seemed that way from the discussions that I had with other women, that women would report the behavior, nothing was done. It didn't seem like he was being reprimanded or talked to or given an opportunity to change his behavior. And so that resulted in him being fired because there was sort of this backlog of stories that then got revealed, if that makes sense. And so I think that we ought to behave in a much different way in companies in which, when poor behavior happens, that doesn't mean that's a death sentence for a particular man, but that that he is held responsible and accountable for those behaviors, but he's also given an opportunity to change those behaviors before necessarily losing his job. But what's happening now is that there's basically this really long history in a lot of companies of unreported or unresolved sexism situations. And so what that has resulted in with the Me Too movement is a lot of men being fired like that, but not actually having the opportunity to change their behavior because it's too late, because those behaviors have been institutionalized and supported for so long that they've become really big and really ugly, as opposed to what would happen, if the work culture was healthier from the beginning, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, but don't you think that they sort of deserve it if they're being sexist to get fired? Even though they maybe don't get really a chance to speak their word or defend themselves.
I just think that there's enough blame to go around, and it's not just. I do think that John no longer deserved to be in a position of power, in a sense, and that he needs to do a lot of healing and soul searching and kind of processing his own behavior and his psychology. But it's like, who gets to be the judge of these types of things, and when is the breaking point? And I don't know that I'm the authority to be able to answer that necessarily. I think it's up to the institution, and so I respect their decision to let him go. But it's like, I also believe that the institution is largely to blame, that companies are to blame. And that's the thing about corporate life that is so complicated, is that when something goes awry and something is amiss in a corporate culture, it's almost like no one's to blame, because it's a big collective of people that are all kind of, condoning certain behaviors together. And I think even I was guilty of condoning that behavior when I was in the institution, because I wanted so much to keep my job at the time, and I wanted to impress people, and I wanted to be perceived as a good employee. And so I didn't push up against the grain of what was happening, even though I knew morally and ethically that it was wrong. So I just don't like to point these fingers of blame, because I feel like we all have a lot to learn from these situations. And deserving or not deserving isn't something that I like to be the judge of necessarily, because I like to look at things from a place of compassion, and to really think about how and why people behave the way that they do. And that way we can actually change and we can improve the situation for everyone. And I think that this model of just firing or exiling anyone who behaves badly or who gets called out, like the Me Too movement has done, it basically just ostracizes a large group of powerful men, and it doesn't really do the work of reforming them, of really deeply learning from those mistakes and learning how can we do it better? How can we because these are people with talent, these are people with vision, these are people with incredible gifts that they've been sharing with the world, for decades. So, what can we do after that goes beyond just firing them and kicking them out of the industry? And I think that there should be a big process to that before letting someone back into a position of power like that. But I don't think that we should just, shut everybody out who does something wrong, because there's deep societal reasons for why these things are happening that goes well above, any individual person's behavior.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, with what you just said about it being a bigger thing than just people being sensitive, it's almost like group pressure. I feel like is that right? With that, and then you mentioned in your article that even though John Lasseter and a bunch of other people got fired, the way of sexism kind of rippled through the company, so it might still be there. What do you think it will take to completely get rid of the sexism?
Well, I think it's really important that when people see something that doesn't feel right, whether it's to you or to someone around you, that we really start to speak up, and to be brave and to kind of stick our necks out and communicate that, hey, this isn't okay, whether it's sexism or racism or homophobia or any of the isms, any kind of alienation of an individual, on the basis of their skin color or their gender or something that has nothing to do with their work, right? I think we really need to start speaking those things, and we don't necessarily need to be really punishing about it, depending on, of course, on what the issue is, but to just be more honest, I think, as a species. And there's just so much silencing that goes on, and a lot of that has to do with privilege and power. And companies, there are certain people who are paid the most and who are respected the most and who are seen as, more valuable than other people. And I think a really brilliant, corporation or group of executives will look at all of their employees as equally valuable, and that young people and new hires and women and people from other countries and people with different, diverse perspectives are just as valuable, if not more, than these, older grandfathered in whatever you want to call it, these sort of trophy figure director types or whatever it is, leader types. I think that the world is changing in a big way because of the internet, because of social media, because of Me Too, because of Black Lives Matter, because of all these protests and, you know, all the social uprisings that are happening, and people are using their voices more and more often. And I think that even companies and you know, management teams and executives are starting, hopefully, to realize that, you know, it's not the people who complain about poor behavior that are the problem. And I think that used to be the perspective that, you know, these sort of golden boys are our pride and joy, and we have to protect them from any negativity whatsoever. And that if anyone complains or says something upsetting about them, we have to silence that person. You know, they're the problem. And I think that Me Too has really changed, like turned the table on that dynamic, and has hopefully made executives realize that actually it's anyone who behaves badly and treats someone like they're less worthy of respect that is the problem. And they're the ones that need to be dealt with or to be, you know, not reprimanded or punished. I don't know what there's a resolution that needs to occur around that. What else? I had something else, but it slipped my mind. So I'll just let it go and maybe it'll come back. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and so I think more open dialogue is really important. And another thing that is problematic about the way things, you know, were, or when I was in the corporate world, or still are potentially, is just that corporations themselves have so much power over people. And there's really kind of like a mind game and a manipulation that goes on around that. But also, like, people are terrified to speak up against like a corporate entity or a corporate leader because it could cost them their career. And the beautiful thing about the tech revolution is that that's not really the case anymore. You know, now we can work remotely. We can work for companies around the world. We can do things, you know, with more flexibility and freedom. And so we're not so tied to one company like we were even just before COVID. Like, I think the coronavirus forcing so many workers into remote working situation has totally changed the entire world economy. And so where it once was, oh, I live in San Francisco and I studied animation and this is what I do, and my kids go to school here and I have a whole family here, and Pixar is the only animation company in San Francisco. So I have too much to lose to say something against my boss because I have bills to pay, and this is my career, you know, and I'm attached to it. And now I think with this whole remote working system being more and more a thing, I feel like that's going to give individual people more power, because if they feel disrespected in their remote work environments, it's much easier for them to just say, okay, bye, you know, I'm done with this, and move on to something else. And so I think that that's going to really turn the tables on the power that the corporation once had over individuals' lives. That's what one thing that I'm hoping for anyway.
Yeah.
And then one of the other factors around sexism, if this makes sense, like San Francisco, in a way, I lived there for 7 years, and I feel like cities in each country have a certain personality type. Like LA is sort of the movie star place, right? And New York is kind of like this sharky workaholic place. And San Francisco, in a lot of ways, is like a nerd capital, right? It's like Silicon Valley and technology and all these sort of, you know, app developers and coders and programmers. And so a lot of the men, it's mostly men. It's like a largely male population city. But most of the people that go to San Francisco, a lot of them are in high school. They're these nerdy guys who are really good at math or computers or things like that, and they're terrible with women, and they get picked on or bullied in high school and don't get much feminine attention. And then they go to San Francisco, they make lots of money, they get kind of, more privilege and more prosperity. Sometimes they get, more fit and attractive or whatever. But what happens is that those wounds of being the guy in high school who was bullied or dismissed by girls, it doesn't change. That feeling of, having an issue with women or having resentments towards women is still there. And so I think it's really important for us to all look at what happened to us in our past, in our childhood, in our youth, that might be affecting who we are as adults and how we behave as adults, because that really gets to the bottom of it. Because you can talk ad nauseum about your adult life, but if you don't actually look behind you at why is it that I feel this way, or that I want, to be the big man on campus who can grab women, or do you know what I mean? Like, where is that coming from? And there's almost always an origin story in our past, in our youth. So.
Yes. Yeah. So, Maya, did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. I don't have it written. I have it written on my so 2 seconds. Yes, you wrote in the article that Jennifer Lee was maybe going to take John Lasseter's place, replace him. Do you think that she will change the sexism there, or maybe reduce some of the sexism that now it's a female leader?
Well, I think she ended up taking over John's role in Disney animation. And then at Pixar, a man named Pete Docter, who was the director of Up and Monsters Incorporated and Inside Out and films like that. He's an amazing director and an amazing person. So he's since took over, and that's been quite some time now. I think it's probably been a couple of years now since Pete took over John's role. And, I think it would have obviously made a very different statement and a different impact had a woman, taken that role at Pixar. But Pete Docter is, in my experience, a very, he's not a sexist man. I've never had or heard anything like that coming from him, from the company, from the culture, from my friends, and my personal experiences with him. I worked on Inside Out with him. And I also just, you hear, even if you don't spend a lot of time in the room with a particular director, the company talks. And so the Whisper network at Pixar was quite alive. And so you kind of get a sense, especially from my female friends, as to how certain people behave. And Pete Docter, I think, is a model example of the kind of person that should be in a leadership role. And so I was really, really happy and relieved to hear that he took over. And my friend, her name is Domi Shi. She's a Chinese-Canadian immigrant to the United States. I think she might be on a working visa, but she is going to be the first woman, hopefully, to direct a feature film at Pixar. And she's quite young. She's in her mid to late 20s. And when I was back at Pixar, she was just developing kind of a connection with Pete. And Pete pulled her aside and said, I think you're incredibly talented, and I want to meet with you for lunches and talk about your ideas. And I'm really excited about what I can learn from you. And that's really humbling whenever an Oscar-winning director says that. And I think she was 24, 25 at the time, and really recognizes that a good idea and a good story can actually come from anywhere. Pixar has that as one of their mottos, that a good idea can come from anywhere. But I think a lot of the men previously in leadership weren't really living by that, whereas I think Pete does. And you can see that in Pete's films as well. Inside Out has a female lead character. It's all about emotions and sensitivity. And Pete and the producer, Jonas Rivera, they both have daughters, and they both said that they were creating that film as kind of a love story to their daughters. And so I think things have dramatically changed since Pete took over. And also, I've just heard from friends that are still there that they've made quite a few like leadership changes since the article came out, and have really like investigated these various different types of issues, whether it be sexism outright or, exclusionary behavior where it's kind of this boys club where men get more privileges and get casted for things more often than women. And so I think that they've done quite a lot to change that and to pay attention to that since the news came out. And, I feel in some sense guilty that it came to the place that like, I felt like it had to go public. I had to go public with the story in order to like force that kind of change in a way, or to inspire that kind of change, because from the inside, it just feels like trying to push a glacier. Like when you talk to a manager and the manager already has a different agenda or just wants to dismiss you. I had lots of friends that would report what was happening, and the change just wasn't occurring. And I think that's why Me Too happened, because a lot of women were, making some attempts to change their situation from the inside, and it just wasn't working. And so they had to kind of go around the system and publicize this sort of bad news in order to get people to pay attention. And I think they are paying attention a lot more. Even if the company hasn't been outed specifically, I think just the cultural movement has really changed the way that company culture behaves.
I think I have one more question.
Sure.
Okay. But okay, wait. No, you. I see you have already answered this one. It was why do you think women are more disrespected than men? But you have already answered that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just it's like part of our history as a species. Like if you look at the way, like we've been living in a patriarchal culture for I think upwards of 2,000 years now. So this is an old story, and it just keeps getting played out. And even though we've had feminist movements and civil rights movements and equality movements in the past, it's like, I feel like every time we go through, like, in the 60s and 70s when a lot of protests and activism was happening, I feel like they were dealing with much bigger issues at that time. Like women really, and Me Too, like, yes, there were still rape stories and things like that. But back then it was like women weren't even being allowed to work, or women weren't even being allowed to vote at certain times in our history, or women, were just completely not even allowed in the door. Like they weren't given the job because they were women, and that was legal at certain points in various countries around the world, right? And so we kind of like push through certain barriers with every generation. And now that Me Too has happened, the generation beyond us will probably have more barriers to push through in terms of equality. Just because these things are in our brains. It's deep-seated in our neural pathways, and those can be reprogrammed. But the images that we see in the media, the things that we see in advertisement, the things that we see in our family units, the things we see on the street, like all of this affects and imprints us as people, and we're conditioned and programmed differently depending on what kind of body we're born into. Usually. So men have certain perceptions about what's okay and moral from a very unspoken level, and as do women. And so it just takes a lot of work and time and attention and conversation to kind of untie these sort of fallacies, right? That a man is a superior director to a woman, or that a man can be a better this than that. Like, none of that is real. It's just an illusion. But it's a very well articulated and kind of like elaborate illusion that we've been taught in a lot of different ways. And so I think your generation is going to have a whole other, and hopefully it's refining it every time we go through one of these, revolutionary stages. And so hopefully at some point it just becomes second nature for us to treat each other like we're all the same, because we are.
Yeah. Okay. Just quickly, what do you think about Me Too?
I think it was necessary. I think it was powerful, but I think in some ways there was a little bit. It's like a pendulum swinging. So, in some ways, I think that Me Too maybe was a little bit violent or forceful in its kind of dismantling or dethroning of these powerful men. And it was almost like you didn't, the danger with Me Too is that really not to say that a lot of women would have a motivation to do this, or that I assume the worst out of people. But the truth is that anyone could have written a smear campaign article, whether it was truth or not, and basically destroyed someone's career through that. And that actually, is something to notice and to be cautious of. And so I hope that companies genuinely investigated all the claims, including my own. I don't think that my word should just be taken as truth, because, any of us could lie, any of us could tell the truth. And so I really hope that every company that took a man out of power, demoted someone, or fired someone, genuinely investigated what happened. But I also think that one of the problems with Me Too is that it was all about allowing women to speak, and that needed to happen, and that's necessary to happen. But beyond that, and that's what I want, a new kind of movement to kind of arise in this moment, because it's been, 3 years since Me Too started. And I want this second phase, maybe it's another phase of Me Too, maybe it's a whole other movement, to be more inclusively also hearing the stories of the men who were accused. Because a lot of these storylines, I mean, some of them were taken to court, right? Like Harvey Weinstein and things like that. But in these other cases that are a bit more subtle sexism, that aren't overt harassment or rape, like when someone physically attacks another person, of course they should be taken out of their job. That's criminal, right? But in these more subtle cases where it's exclusion, or it's, looking at someone like they're an object every day, or giving someone, touching someone uncomfortably, like a hug or something, and, holding them too long, these more subtle things, I do think that we ought to really have a more inclusive dialogue where we actually, and it's called, there's a system for it, it's called restorative justice. It's where you actually take, you could take a rape victim and the accused rapist and put them in a room with the moderator and allow them both to tell their full story. And I think that what we can learn from that is actually more profound and more powerful than just hearing the one side of it, if that makes sense. But a lot of people, I would suggest these kinds of things in conversations sometimes, and people got really angry with me for suggesting that we sit and talk to men who have been accused of, behaving badly towards women. But how do we actually learn from those mistakes? How do we stop teaching boys that it's okay to behave that way if we don't actually hear why that man became who he was, and actually give him a chance to fully apologize as well if he wants to?
Yeah, no, I think it completely makes sense. Also, just when I go on Twitter sometimes, and there's been this huge expose, it feels like this hate mob can sometimes be so loud and so noiseful without any proof. And then when the person or the man often comes out with an answer, it doesn't really. They're already on to the next one.
Right.
And that also reminds me of like the Johnny Depp case, where his wife was the one to accuse him, but then it actually ended up being on the other way around, and Johnny Depp is still suffering to this day from this false accusations. That's really bad.
Right.
So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes women also, like, we have our own trauma that affects how we perceive what's happening to us in the present moment, right? So if I was abused as a young girl by men, that I trusted, I might have a very, very hard time trusting men as an adult woman. And when someone says or does something to me in the present moment, I actually might mentally skew that because psychologically I'm still holding traumas from the past that can distort what I'm perceiving in the present. So it's really complicated stuff. It's not simple. And that's why I think people are so afraid to talk about it because it is so complicated and it feels like minefields, And when we get the court of law involved, it's even more horrifying. And so I just think it's a really scary time to be a man or a young boy as well, because so much is being, it's really messy. It's a messy time. So much is being revealed, but so many wounds are being revealed, but they're not fully being healed. And I think, men and boys don't actually have really great examples of how to behave in a respectful way towards women, but also to, still be able to express who they are sexually or express desire or things like that are healthy and they're normal part of being human. But we haven't quite figured out, how to work together and coexist together and have those exist and do it in a respectful way and in a healthy way. Because it's not necessarily a bad thing for a man to be attracted to a woman or vice versa. It's just how we behave and how we approach those things, and also how we do or don't take those into the workplace where it's meant to be a professional environment. But I think that we still have a lot of work to do, like a lot. But it's really good. Like I've been doing a couple of interviews. I actually did an interview last month for like a newspaper called the USA Today, because they're putting out an article about women in STEM fields, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And, they're finding that despite all these efforts in the school system to bring more women into these industries, it's still massively dominated by men. And that actually has more to do with like young women being discouraged by their families, by their teachers, by their peers from pursuing those trades. And it actually has to do with, young women being interested or being capable enough to do those things. So we have to be careful about that too, like how we pigeonhole women, like that women should only be doing certain roles and men should be doing others. I think, sometimes women can do very masculine things as a profession or preference, and sometimes men can do very feminine things as and we should just really allow people to fall wherever feels comfortable and feels like more joyful for them, and get rid of all of these preconceived notions about who's best at this and that and the other thing.
Yeah, I'm listening, and it's making sense. So as you mentioned earlier, there was actually a guy or more that got fired because of your story. I just want to ask, like, was it scary sharing your story?
Yeah. Yeah. I spent like 7 or 8 months writing that article. It's a long article, first of all, but I knew in my heart that I really wanted to share my story because I felt like it was a story that needed to be shared for the sake of the women that were still in that company, for the sake of the women in that industry, for the sake of women in general, for the sake of myself, just like honoring my sense of truth. And when I started, seeing what other women were doing in Me Too, it really inspired me to do that. And because I left the industry and I was working freelance, I no longer felt that sense of like those corporations and those companies didn't have the power over me anymore that they once did. And so I felt, kind of obligated to share. But I agonized over that piece for a very long time because I wanted to make sure that it was clean, that I was coming from a place of compassion, that I was telling the truth, but not exaggerating it or diminishing it in any way, that I was telling an accurate truth, and that I wasn't coming from a place of like vindictiveness or wanting revenge or anger. And so it took me months to like release my actual anger and my feelings of trauma, and to really, and I have like, pages and pages of sort of dumped writing that it was like, oh, that's just, I needed to say that for myself, but that's going to go in the scrap pile kind of thing. And so I really polished the piece to make sure that it was in integrity. And then the other thing was I was afraid legally that like maybe, it's a big, powerful corporation with lots of lawyers, maybe they would come after me or something like that. And I actually ended up having a law firm volunteer to kind of consult with me pro bono because they were trying to support women and whistleblowers. And so they went through the article and gave me advice on, things to include and not to include. But the day that I published, it was kind of it was terrifying just to see what the response would be. Would all these people that I used to work with hate me? Those kinds of feelings, or was it, just questioning for myself, like, well, did I do enough when I was working there to try to express these things? And I tried to own that as much as possible in the article, that, I actually do have regrets about how I navigated things when I was there. But one of the beauties of the internet is that I got like hundreds of messages in the months after I published from a lot of people who messaged me were people who just love animation, people who wanted to work in animation, parents of daughters who wanted to be in animation, all types of people just asking questions. But a lot of it came from Pixar employees, and many of it was messages from women, and they shared their stories with me and cried. People were just saying, this article brought me to tears, and thank you so much for sharing it. And on the stories that I heard from these other women made me feel really validated in my decision, because it became really clear after I heard all hundreds of more stories coming through that this was really something that was necessary to do and it was honorable. And so that gave me this sense of relief, that I wasn't kind of making something bigger out of it, that it was genuinely a really big problem for many decades, and so I heard stories from women who worked at Pixar 20 years ago, and were experiencing these kinds of things. So these were issues that have a long history. Hope I'm not boring you guys.
Oh, no, not boring at all. Your answers are really good.
Well, what do you guys think about Me Too? I'm curious, as young people, what you think of the movement and everything that's going on in the internet these days.
It was really interesting when you talked about the men's sides of because I hadn't really thought about that, because of course women can be exaggerating or so I hadn't really thought about that, but I think the Me Too is really great. But now that you said that, I think that I have a bit mixed feelings about it, because it's very women just their voices heard, and I don't think that men really I don't think I've ever seen like a post where a man was like, "Hey, this happened to me." But I still think that Me Too is like good, and I'm glad that it starts with people that can like share their stories and like make others feel less alone. But yes, I hadn't really thought about the men's side that much, but that gives me something to think about, of course, what you said.
Yeah, and I think it's less of a concern for me that women are lying or exaggerating, but it's more even just like, I want to get to the bottom of the problem so that we can really change it. And to get to the bottom of the problem, we need to really know why. And to know why a man behaves the way, like, I can't answer for you why John Lasseter behaved the way he did. He's the one who can answer that, but he's probably terrified to even speak about the subject, because of how intense the dialogue is, and how, it's like you just want to exile and throw away anyone who does wrong. And if we don't learn from our mistakes as a collective, then we don't stand much chance of doing it better next time, I think. Yeah.
That makes sense.
But I think it's an exciting time to be alive, for sure. And I've been like looking at TikTok and stuff and things that younger people are more interested in. I'm 37, so I'm almost 40, but I'm still a tech person, so I can, get up to speed with this stuff. But I'm really excited by how creative young people are, and also by how brave they are. I feel like these days, being yourself is the new cool. And I have a lot of hope that the younger generations are going to do a much better job than we are. And I think that's how it goes, right? Like, my generation is probably doing a better job with these kinds of issues than my mother's generation or my grandparents' generation, right? If I listen to their stories, it's like even more horrifying than things that I'm experiencing. But yeah, I just am really hopeful that we will start to really recognize that our individuality is a really valuable thing, and that diversity is a really valuable thing that should be honored and cherished, and that the companies that are going to be more and more successful in this new digital world where everything is so much more public are going to be the companies that see every employee as equal, as valuable. I fully believe that. So yeah, I think that there's a lot to be hopeful around. Oh, and I can send you guys a link, but on June 18th, the USA Today article is coming out that I got interviewed for. And I also created a video that's just like tips and advice for anyone who, it's mainly for women entering a male-dominated field, but it really can apply to anyone that just feels outnumbered or alienated in some way in the workforce, or in the workforce that they're hoping to enter. And so it's just a kind of a list of suggestions of how to navigate those. So I can send you guys a link when it goes live.
Yes, that's nice.
Cool. And it was really nice to talk to you guys.
Yes, it was really nice that you wanted to talk with us. It's very interesting.